HighBridge Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th-Century America by Saidiya Hartman. Read by Janina Edwards. Forward. Keeanga Yamada Taylor. In the United States, we like to discuss the distortions of the nation's history as amnesia, when it is more appropriate to understand our affliction as selective memory clouded with omissions intended to obscure the raw truth about our society. A few years ago, I traveled to New Orleans for a family vacation after a semester of teaching about slavery in the United States. I was anxious to visit the city, knowing that by the time the United States ended its role in the transatlantic slave trade, New Orleans had become the center of a robust internal marketplace for enslaved labor. Today, Americans think of New Orleans as a cultural capital known for its street parties and its Cajun and Creole cuisine, and some may even be familiar with its history of jazz and other Black artistic creations. But there is almost no trace of its vital role in the history of American slavery. There have been more recent efforts in New Orleans to place a plaque here or there, near areas where tourists traverse, but only to be found by the most adroit. Today, Jackson Square, located in the French Quarter, is at the heart of local tourist attractions and restaurants, but there is hardly any mention or marker of its former function as an open-air marketplace for buying and selling enslaved men, women, and children. There is no public memory of it as the site of the public execution of slaves who participated in an 1811 slave rebellion, the largest in American history. Nor is there any recollection that in its grisly aftermath, the heads of executed slaves were hoisted upon the pikes of the wrought iron gates adorning the park. New Orleans is hardly unique as a site of selective memory when it comes to the public reckoning with its local history of slavery. From the local to the national, our history of slavery has been recast as part of our narrative of forward progress. Where slavery is depicted as our founding national sin, it is as quickly dispatched as having been exorcised through the carnage of the Civil War, setting the United States upon its essential course toward a more perfect union. Slavery's essential role in building the nation's treasure that would, in turn, facilitate its rise as the most powerful nation on earth has been minimized, if not wholly ignored, as have been the roots of slavery to the nation's enduring crisis of racism and its attendant impacts within the lives of Black people thereafter. Saidiya Hartman's powerful exploration of slavery and freedom in the United States, Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th-Century America, first appeared in print in 1997, during the last period of spoiled race relations in the 20th century. Just a few years prior to its publication, the United States had experienced the Los Angeles Rebellion, the largest urban insurrection in American history. In response to the uprising, the American state rallied its political forces around crime legislation and a prison-building bonanza. The draconian response provoked the unprecedented outpouring mobilized in the form of the Million Man March, organized by Louis Farrakhan and led by the Nation of Islam. The march was not conceived of as a protest, but became a massive gathering of Black men dejected and marginalized within an increasingly repressive United States. The mounting instability of racial politics in the late 1990s precipitated then-President Bill Clinton's poorly conceived Conversation on Race to be facilitated by a new commission to study race relations in the United States. Shortly after its formation, that commission produced a dubiously titled report called the One America Initiative. The remedies that emerged for healing the racial divide in the United States included a heated debate over whether the president should apologize for slavery. In 1998, when Bill Clinton traveled to Africa, the intensifying debate over the apology continued, even as his spokesperson assured the American public he certainly is going to talk about the legacy of slavery and the scar that it represents on America, but an apology would be extraneous and off the point. In lieu of an apology, he eventually conceded the painfully obvious. Going back to the time before we were even a nation, European Americans received the fruits of the slave trade, and we were wrong in that. 25 years later, The United States is embroiled in new turmoil in its latest iteration of a national reckoning about the continuing role of racism in American society. In the summer of 2020, the cumulative weight of the Trump presidency's embrace of white supremacy, coupled with the horrific carnage produced by the unprecedented onslaught of a novel coronavirus chewing its way through black communities, gave way to unprecedented protests when an explosive video captured a modern-day lynching of George Floyd at the hands of a white police officer. It provoked the latest national awakening about the continued power of racism within American society, which has returned us to old and unresolved discussions about the role of slavery in American history as a way of understanding the longevity of racism in the United States. This has included a renewed discussion about reparations for African Americans as compensations for a history of unpaid labor. To that end, the only federal legislation to emerge from the rebellions and protests of the summer of 2020 has not been for police reform or in the establishment of new programs intended to improve the life chances of black people. It has been the establishment of Juneteenth, a new national holiday to commemorate when federal troops arrived in Texas and freed the enslaved. This kind of national celebration of the symbolic, while leaving undisturbed the architecture of oppression that has made African Americans disproportionately vulnerable to premature death and a travestied freedom, has been a hallmark of the black experience since the abolition of slavery. This is not to say that the national recognition of the end of slavery is unimportant, but it does serve to reinforce what formally concluded while paying almost no attention to what carried on after slavery. Instead, the celebrations of the abolition of slavery and the misassumption that inaugurated black people into personhood and then citizenship have served to mute other conversations about the ways that one form of bondage gave way to new, coercive relationships. This is less about cynicism concerning the immutability of racism or even anti-blackness than it is an expression of extraordinary pessimism about American liberalism and all of its haughty conceits about its universalism, autonomy, and justice. Neither a historian nor social scientist, Saidiya Hartman is a scholar of criticism, law, cultural history, and slavery. Scenes was a pioneering achievement of interdisciplinary scholarship, just as such work was being called upon to provide differing insights while applying varied methodological applications as a means to invoke different kinds of interventions. Here, Hartman's work breathed new life into scholastic understanding of performance studies, as well as prescient analyses of racial capitalism in cultural studies and criticism. Indeed, Scenes should be considered among the texts that have spelled out the mutually constitutive relationship between racism and capitalism in American history. Hartman has become a master at cracking through disciplinary and genre roadblocks and facades that for years have acted as gatekeepers around specific bodies of knowledge. Yet Scenes, and subsequent work from Hartman, upholds scholarly standards of rigor based in evidence and command of scholarly debates, including where one fits and departs from the conversations. Indeed, Scenes of Subjection does not retell the history of slavery and emancipation. Instead, Hartman is asking us to think differently about these events, not as part of the narrative arc of justice and progress in American history, but as affirmation of a kind of deeply constrained and compromised conception of democracy and liberty in the first place, which, inevitably, then gave way to constrained and compromised visions of freedom in slavery's aftermath. Hartman is challenging the assumption that the continued forms of subjugation endured by ordinary black people after slavery's end are only the result of ongoing patterns of exclusion from the governing and financial institutions of the country, leaving inclusion as the solution. Instead, Hartman has asked us to consider different questions, namely, what is meant by freedom? If freedom is simply the opposite of bondage, while affording nothing other than the right to compete with other free people in a human scrum for income, food, clothing, and housing, then it is an exceedingly thin and narrow conception of liberty. If, however, we think of freedom as a right to move through life with genuine self-possession that can only be rooted in the satisfaction of basic human needs and desires, then black emancipation in the United States was something altogether different. Indeed, how could a conception of freedom that was so intimately conjoined with enslavement produce any other outcome, when the only thing separating slavery from freedom was the declaration that it was over? With no effort to address the past, to heal the deformation cast unto blackness that had been used to rationalize and legitimize slavery, and with no effort to ease the transition from property to person with freedom dues, then, as Du Bois lamented, the freed people enjoyed an ever-brief moment in the sun, only to return to a condition as near to slavery as slavery itself. It is also important to convey that the historical omissions and the occurrences of unfreedom that shaped the black entry into personhood in the United States and that have been perpetuated thereafter are not simply oversights, unfortunate slips, or other kinds of accidental erasures born of ignorance and, essentially, innocence. They are contrived, mean-spirited, and deliberate. The United States' self-idealization as an exceptional country in its democratic founding and promises of unfettered social mobility necessarily diminishes the centrality of slavery and racism in the country's ascendance as a world power. Indeed, the country's periodic return to slavery as a metaphorical original sin not only creates an origin story for racism in the United States, but it also explains its persistence after slavery as a hangover or vestige in an otherwise narrative arc bending toward progress. Where racism does reoccur, it is the work of backward individuals who see color. Where disparities in jobs, housing, education, and beyond exist, the problem is with the individual unable to assimilate into the affluence that America has to offer. The notion of systemic racism is rejected, while lapsed personal responsibility is assumed. And where white poverty is hidden and thus exoticized upon discovery, black poverty is ubiquitous, expected, and ultimately paradigmatic. Hartman is suggesting that instead of thinking of America's persisting crises of racial inequity, domination, and subjugation as the accumulated toll of missed opportunities, failed programs, and policy conundrums, that perhaps we consider a deeper existential problem with American democracy itself. American freedom, liberty, justice, and ultimately democracy came into being through slavery, genocide, rape, dispossession, murder, and terror. Indeed, it was the actual existence of slavery that crystallized the moral valence of liberty and freedom for the founders. It is well known that the leading lights of the American Revolution compared their status as colonial subjects of the British Parliament to enslavement. The founders invoked slavery as a rallying cry to marshal their forces. It was part rhetoric and metaphor, but it was also buttressed by a reality that, in fact, they intimately understood, that slavery meant an abject absence of freedom and total subordination to another person's will. The deep understanding of slavery as slaveholders formed their understanding of freedom and liberty. Moreover, the enslaved embodied abject blackness, thus providing a negative mirror for white men to imagine their lives in sharp contrast to. Consider the insights of a white lawyer from South Carolina who wrote in 1775, "Liberty is a principle which naturally and spontaneously contrasts with slavery. In no country on earth can the line of distinction ever be marked so boldly. Here there is a standing subject of comparison, which must be ever perfect and ever obvious. The constant example of slavery stimulates a free man to avoid being confounded with the blacks. Slavery, so far from being inconsistent, has, in fact, a tendency to stimulate and perpetuate the spirit of liberty." It is not only that slavery provided a negative meaning for American liberty, but its realization within private property, possessive individualism, and its eventual glorification of the so-called free market narrowed its benefits to an even smaller number, initially to be shared among wealthy white men with land, and eventually to white men of any standing. Given the symmetry between slavery and freedom, then, for Hartman, the persistence of unfreedom in the aftermath of slavery was predictable. The voices of those African Americans who lived within and then after slavery could attest to this confounding reality as clearly as anyone. In 1937, a woman who had lived in slavery and was later interviewed in the controversial Works Progress Administration project that recorded survivors of slavery could speak to these continuities. Her name was Patsy Mitchner, and she perfectly captured the riddle of American freedom in black hands. She said, "Slavery was a bad thing, and freedom, of the kind we got, with nothing to live on, was bad. Two snakes full of poison, one lying with his head pointing north, the other with his head pointing south. Their names was Slavery and Freedom. The snake called Slavery lay with his head pointed south, and the snake called Freedom lay with his head pointed north. Both bit the nigger, and they was both bad." It is important to note that Hartman's examination is not a new tributary feeding the large pools of critical race theory that have examined the ways that American law has been a tool in stripping the meaning and substance out of black achievement of civil rights. As she writes in her endnotes, legal liberalism, as well as critical race theory, has examined issues of race, racism, and equality by focusing on the exclusion and marginalization of those subjects and bodies marked as different. The disadvantage of this approach is that the proposed remedies and correctives to the problem, inclusion, protection, and greater access of opportunity, do not ultimately challenge the economy of racial production or its truth claims or interrogate the exclusions constitutive of the norm, but instead seek to gain equality, liberty, and redress within its confines. In other words, by simply examining the regime of exclusions that has been at the heart of liberal critiques of the American state, the nature of the state has gone under-examined. This is especially true of mid-20th century racial liberalism, which held the assumption that the central problem in the United States was that of exclusion, as opposed to extraction, accumulation, and dispossession as organizing principles for the American state and the political class that facilitates its function. In other words, the racial liberals assumed that the inclusion of black Americans into the American mainstream would produce a large black middle class, as had been done among white Americans. While it is undoubtedly true that some portions of black Americans were incorporated into the mainstream of American society, different modes of inclusion also included new opportunities for economic exploitation, dispossession, and extraction from African Americans as well. It was a well-rehearsed pattern, even if in different eras, different intentions motivated the rhetoric of inclusion. For example, after emancipation, the inclusion of African Americans into contract making, a document joining together parties based on their own will and volition, did not only create new opportunities for autonomy, but also for new forms of coercion, as the elite of the white South raced to reconstitute their labor force under conditions as close to slavery as they could legally finagle. It is the nature of the liberal American state to which Hartman returns, and its particularly pernicious effects in the lives of black people. But the absence of self-determination afforded to freed people meant that even when they were formally accepted into the body politic or civic society, inclusion existed within a web of coercive inducements masquerading as sovereign individualism. Capitalist societies like the United States proselytized the virtues of autonomy and self-possession, while simultaneously organizing an economic order that produced class differences that impaired unfettered access to rights, property, and other forms of wealth and possession. As Hartman points out, after slavery, there were two freedoms in the United States: freedom from bondage and the freedom to starve. Freedoms correlated with the market produced enormous wealth and power for some, but immiserating poverty for others, and in the process undermined the autonomy, liberty, and self-possession of the poor and working classes. In other words, post-emancipation American freedom was imagined as consistent and the fulfillment of a market-based economy, thus valorizing individualism and autonomy as products of personal success. In contrast to what historian Thomas Holt observed, throughout most of human history, the highest value or good has been to achieve a sense not of autonomy, but of belonging, that psychic and physical security of incorporation into the group. Nevertheless, these were the conditions of freedom into which black freed people were liberated. Their situation was then compounded by color and utter dispossession, thereby heightening the coercive measures undertaken to compel black people to return to the work that had previously defined their existence. Hartman is also suggesting something beyond the deficiencies of the American state to understand the continuing patterns of subjugation that define the black experience. Part 1 of Scenes is dedicated to interrogating the ways that the black subject is constructed and how this construction contributes to their marginalization in the aftermath of slavery. Indeed, the insistence that black freed people could simply slip into the garments of American citizenship with no trace of the badges or incidents of slavery as garish adornments upon their person was to ignore the ways that blackness had been cast as abject in the hands of buyers and sellers of black bodies. This blind spot obscured the ways that slavery, race, and racism marked the black body, then ignored how those etchings placed the black subject outside of and beyond the rationale and logic of universalism, including the legal frameworks that had been built to govern a republic conceived of as only for white men. Within the regime of slavery, slave subjectivity did not exist in any formal capacity beyond the ways that the state could define the crimes of the enslaved and enumerate punishment against the enslaved. But with no punishment by the 19th century for the rape or murder of the enslaved, black women, men, and children were effectively excluded from the liberal framework of personhood and all its attendant rights and responsibilities. The absence of legal protections made the enslaved vulnerable to the forms of depraved violence that pervaded the institution of slavery. The display of violence against the enslaved to engender sympathy or empathy as a means to gather opposition to slavery called upon white sympathizers to put themselves in the place of the slave to form an opposition to slavery. In doing so, the experience of the enslaved person is lost again, while the emotional drama of the white sympathizer is the action that must be assuaged. The result may, in fact, be the end of slavery, but nothing has been done to repair or restore the harm done to the enslaved. In fact, the experiences of the enslaved have barely been attended because the focus has been trained on the emotional experience of white witnesses. It is also an example of the ways that, within the liberal framework, even abolitionists were complicit in reinforcing conceptions of abject blackness while decrying slavery. For Hartman, this is not a morality play. It is simply to say that slavery was so closely sutured to freedom in America that it was impossible to imagine the social relations of black and white outside of its paradigm. Hartman argues for a different approach in distilling the brutality of slavery. By looking at what she describes as the quotidian routines of slavery, Hartman suggests that we can see something even more insidious about the institution. In this way, she examines the demands of slaves as entertainment for white audiences as a potentially more fruitful place to understand slavery as a site of domination. Here, Hartman's delve into performance and the multiple meanings of embodiment in her discussion of blackness as an invention of white society not only draws attention to a different kind of brutality during this period, but it also prefaces the extraordinary complexity of black freedom after slavery. The forced jocularity created through the command of white audiences, but also as deception deployed by the enslaved, in both cases as a means to dissimulate either terror or disobedience, was also evidence of the brutality of slavery. Whether making the enslaved dance through the Middle Passage, charm on the auction block, or minstrel to brighten the doldrums of white workers, blackness is construed as irrevocably joyful, carefree, lascivious, and impervious. Even where enslaved people slipped into the affectations of blackness to comfort an owner with their submission, there was no greater evidence of subjection. But the misunderstanding of black participation within these formal and informal routines could also be touted as evidence of volition, will, and agency within the framework of slavery. These perceptions reinforced ideas that remained popular about American slavery well into the 20th century, namely, that the institution was familial and pastoral, thereby assuming the complicity of the enslaved, albeit with periodic eruptions of patriarchal violence. Where those ideas don't necessarily prevail, we still find their trace. Consider the school of new social historical studies of slavery that emerged in the 1960s and 70s. A feature of the new social history was the search for slaves' resistance to their condition as evidence to challenge the perception that slaves were so dominant that they had no conceivable lives outside of the direction of their owners. The new social historians, many of whom had been influenced by the social movements of the 1960s, wanted to show that slaves had their own lives independent of slavery, where examples of their autonomy and self-possession could be identified. Hartman, in anticipation of Walter Johnson's later and well-known and critical essay on agency, cautions against the easy invocation of slaves' agency as a means of capturing slave humanity. If agency is an expression of free will and volition, the very essence of liberal self-making and self-possession, then how do we locate these expressions in the actions of human property? The notion of the consent or autonomy of slaves to opt in or out of anything essentially neutralizes the dilemma of the object status and pained subject constitution of the enslaved and obscures the violence of slavery. Well-intended efforts to humanize the enslaved by pointing to disparate moments of activity can assume consent with enslavement elsewhere. Conflating agency with activity imposes a kind of autonomy and freedom in the choices made by the enslaved that obfuscates the conditions of subjection and abjection understood in a system of slavery. As Hartman argues, if agency is simply about the capacity to act, it does not tell us nearly enough about the conditions within which one is acting, the material makeup of the forces that one is acting against, or the wider context within which these actions take place. Implied in the hunt for slave agency is an implicit representation of slavery as a negotiated relationship where the enslaved could haggle over the terms of their bondage. In the end, the notion that slaves wielded choice or had agency in their daily negotiations within slavery softens our perceptions of the system while humanizing its architects. This, of course, doesn't mean that the enslaved did not resist their enslavement. As Hartman points out, strategies of domination don't exhaust all possibilities of intervention, resistance, escape, refusal, or transformation. The question is how to understand the constraints shaping resistance without reinscribing enslavement as a normative condition. The domination and subordination at the core of American enslavement shaped the afterlife of Black Americans as freed people. The continuation of abuse and recurring efforts across the South to reimpose the conditions of slavery on the freed were enshrined into law with the Black codes in slavery's immediate aftermath. The codes were ultimately abolished and replaced with a new federal law, the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which, along with the Reconstruction Amendments, was passed to allow for African Americans to become citizens of the United States. Black people were no longer formally excluded from the rights endowed by citizenship, but they were also freed with almost no discernible means to create new lives outside of bondage. Their newfound poverty was now mapped onto an existing antipathy of Blackness that had not only built up over 2 centuries of legal enslavement, but that had also been reinforced by new expertise and pseudoscience that elocuted the inferiority and social and scientific deformation of Black people. Moreover, not only had conceptions of freedom like autonomy and possessive individualism only ever been imagined as quintessentially white, the 1866 Civil Rights Act used whiteness as the baseline standard for understanding the rights available to Black people. In the legislation, the enumeration of the rights of citizenship is followed by the phrase, "as is enjoyed by white citizens." The efforts to base new laws, rights, and citizenship on a concept of white universalism obscured more than it clarified. It created the conditions where specific Black demands for redress, repair, or standing could only be construed as special rights. The law performed color blindness in a country where the color-conscious subordination of Black people had been a core feature since its 18th-century founding. In this sense, the modern United States came into formation when the U.S. Supreme Court, in the 1883 civil rights cases, hollowed out the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which had relied upon an expansive reading of the 13th Amendment.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?